the tradition of reading the Bible in Palestine differed from that in Babylonia and beyond in other regions as well. But those were the main sort of splits of traditions. Oral
and pluriformity, you mean that there's not one way of doing it, there's two rival traditions, essentially, of how to read the Bible.
And there are several different traditions because, and in Palestine, there were several different traditions. But one particular oral tradition, that's known as the Tiberian tradition, had a particular prestige because the various oral traditions had different degrees of prestige. So it was the Tiberian tradition which had the greatest prestige, certainly in the Middle Ages, and it seems since late antiquity. And this was a tradition which had been transmitted by scholars in Tiberias associated with the so-called Palestinian yeshiva. The Palestinian yeshiva was the seat of authority of Judaism in Palestine since late antiquity. And
by yeshiva, you mean there was this academy of rabbis or something?
Yeah, it's an academy. It's not. Okay. It was, but it also had it had responsibilities of Jewish legislation as well. I mean, but it also was a center of learning. But certainly since the middle of the first millennium CE, or certainly the early Islamic period, we come to learn about various scholars known as the Masoretes, who were specifically responsible for the transmission and preservation of the transmission of the Bible. And we know that in Tiberias there was a school of Masoretes, and many of them had central positions in the Palestinian yeshiva. In fact, one of the Masoretes in Tiberias was called Pinchas Rosh HaYeshiva, which means he was the head of the yeshiva. So it seems the Masoretic school was a central component of the Palestinian yeshiva.
So that's really well, I'm gonna let you continue, and I have all these questions to follow up. This is very exciting.
Yeah. So the point being is that therefore the activities and the transmission activities of the Tiberian Masoretes was very much associated with the center of Jewish authority, and that almost certainly was one of the main reasons why the Tiberian tradition became regarded as the most authoritative and prestigious tradition in the early Middle Ages. Now, one could ask oneself, why was this specific tradition being transmitted in Tiberias, and why was it endowed with such authority? I mean, okay, it was the tradition which was adopted by the Palestinian yeshiva, but why did they adopt that particular tradition? Now, my own hypothesis, I mean, I have to say that this is a hypothesis, I mean, there is some evidence for it, but was that it's because this Tiberian tradition had roots in an authoritative oral tradition which already was authoritative in the Second Temple period. And it's my own hypothesis this was associated with the temple authorities before the destruction of the temple.
Okay.
And within Second Temple Palestine, there were a variety of oral reading traditions, but already before the destruction of the temple, some of them had become associated specifically with the temple authorities, and they were endowed with a certain amount of authority. Now, I believe the Babylonian tradition that we have at the core of the Babylonian tradition also had its roots in some kind of authoritative oral tradition in Second Temple Palestine. And it's essentially the Tiberian and the Babylonian traditions sort of split off from what I call the proto-Masoretic reading tradition, in which would have most likely have its roots in the temple. Now, the point is that so the Tiberian tradition started off as an authoritative tradition. It was a sort of heritage from the temple, as it seems, the the biblical text in the written form as we know it. I mean, there is some controversy among Qumran scholars about the origin of the written text, as it were, imprecise. But my own feeling is we're dealing with some kind of, it has to be a product of some kind of control or administered control of an authority, and that obvious authority is the temple. So, but that, the main issue here is that this didn't have, it's related not only to the written text, but also to the oral reading, and there was an authoritative oral reading. So the Tiberian tradition, I think, is an heir to that authoritative oral reading tradition of Second Temple Palestine, transmitted by the authoritative seat of Judaism in Palestine, known as the Palestinian Yeshiva. The Codex got adopted, really it appears, from the Islamic environment, and the model of the Quran almost certainly. And this was applied to the Hebrew Bible. And this, among other things, this allowed a greater freedom in terms of notation, in that the scroll was the sacred object which was not changed in any way, whereas the Codex became more of a sort of a study Bible. And this allowed the Masoretes to write down notations like the vowel signs, crucially. But it was the actual shift in the environment to a more writing-based culture that was one of the stimuli to the writing down of the oral tradition. Now, so the issue is, when we're talking about, say, what is the pronunciation of Hebrew, I decided at least the first thing that needs to be done is for us to actually describe in detail the Tiberian pronunciation tradition, because that is the pronunciation tradition which these vowel signs, which we have today in our printed Bibles, represent. However, what happened was that by the mid-10th century, the school of Tiberian Masoretes sort of dispersed after the generation of the two last major master Masoretes, Aharon ben Asher and Moshe ben Naphtali. The school dispersed. And it seems quite rapidly the actual oral tradition of the Tiberian pronunciation tradition began to be forgotten. In the 11th century, there are a few teachers of it around in Palestine. We know that from certain remarks by a Karaite grammarian known as Abul Faraj Harun. But certainly it really became quite rapidly. It quite rapidly fell into oblivion. So already Ibn Janah in Spain in the Middle Ages, a prominent grammarian, said he was not able to get any access to a teacher of Tiberian pronunciation.
This is a Jewish grammarian, one of the most important Jewish grammarians. He says he doesn't have access to a teacher of the Tiberian pronunciation. That's amazing.
Yeah. So it was probably because the Tiberian pronunciation tradition was quite an elite. And it was only really observed by elite, learned people. We have, I mean, it was taught. You know, there were missionaries, as we learn from certain medieval sources, that there were missionaries or teachers that traveled from Tiberias to teach the various communities this tradition. But it was a learned tradition, and the majority of Jews. Well, the majority of Jews in Palestine, for example, were pronouncing Hebrew in a very different way. It was known as the Palestinian pronunciation tradition, which I'll talk about that in a minute. But essentially, the Tiberian pronunciation tradition fell into oblivion.